MissProducer Unfiltered. Woo!
I want to take it from the top. So I want everyone to know, first of all, that this is Ron Wasserman. And we are going to give you everything you need to know about the current conflict in Israel. And I know that everyone's calling it the Israel-Gaza conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I think that it's really important to mention that it's an Arab-Israeli conflict as well. And Ron, you could take us through that in a little bit, but right now, I really think that there's just so much going on the internet, so much misinformation, and especially now that Christmas is approaching and we are about to celebrate Jesus Christ's birthday, I think it's important for a lot of people around the globe to understand that this man was born 2,000 plus years ago in the land of Israel as a Jewish person, and our first arrival as Jewish people in Israel was not in 1948. So that's number one. So having said that, let's just take it from the top and go through biblical times. And I think it's really important to also note that the Bible is not only important to us, and Jerusalem is mentioned over hundreds of times in the Jewish Bible. I think it's also important to note that it's not just a piece of literature that is to be made fun of. It is actually a history book as well. And if you don't want to look to the Bible, then look at actual history books just to kind of prove that we have been there for centuries. So Ron, did you want to start with our presence in the land of Israel? Or
I think a good place to start is the term Jew, right? As you probably know, Nicole, where does the term Jew come from? It literally comes from the land, Judea. I think maybe one of the very few things we can agree with the other side or the enemy of the Jewish people, or even these people protesting who don't want to hear anything that we have to say, is that we are in fact Jews. And if we're going to agree on that fact, you have to understand that we get that name because we came from the land of Judea. And it was, as you know, I'm not an expert to go over every single time that we have been conquered. But when the Romans came, they not only conquered us, but they realized that they needed to separate the Jew from Judea. And it was the Romans who exiled us. We got to Europe the same way the African Americans ended up here. We were conquered, subjugated, and sold into slavery. That's how we got to Europe. It's very offensive to Jews with this whole new anti-Semitic claim of we are European colonial settlers. Again, we don't come from Europe. My mother was born in Iraq. How did she get there? She came from Judea. One of my favorite Bob Marley songs, By the Rivers of Babylon. When we remembered Zion, he's talking about the exile of the Jews from Judea to Iraq. And the same goes for all of our brothers and sisters after the destruction of the Second Temple. That's how we ended up in Europe. We are Jews because we come from Judea. And again, we are the only ethnicity that is not allowed to be indigenous. Nicole, would we ever deny that Irish are indigenous to Ireland, Germans indigenous to Germany, Italians indigenous to Italy, Native Americans indigenous to North America? Only the Jew is not allowed to be indigenous to his ancestral homeland. We are the only ones denied self-determination.
You're absolutely right, and I think it's ridiculous. So just to take the audience through it, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were indigenous to the land of Israel. Before it was called Israel, it was Eretz Canaan, the land of the Canaanites. This was in 17th century before the Common Era. So this is almost 2,000 years before Jesus Christ was even born. We have presence in that section of the world. That is literally where we come from. And you mentioned the Romans. The Romans aren't the first nation that conquered us. Before that, it was Alexander the Great, and we were in the Hellenistic period, the Persians. After that, it was the Romans. Then after that, it was the Byzantine Empire. After that, we have the Crusades, and now we're already going into 1099 to about 1291. And then in around 1500 to 1900, it was occupied by the Ottomans. And after that, and this is around World War I, the British took over, and that's in 1918 until 1948. Now, I want to also make it super clear to everyone that the land of Palestine, okay, which was a British mandate and never a country, was only in existence for about 28 years. So, Ron, if you could just touch on that and when that happened and why it's dangerous to call this piece of land historic Palestine, as people like Patrick Bet David, who's trying to explain the conflict on the internet, who, by the way, I usually love him. But when you go into like a map and try to explain to your millions of listeners and start referring to it as historic Palestine, it's a little biased. And Ron, I'll let you take it from here.
I think we should just back up a few thousand years and then we'll come right back, correct?
Okay, let's do
it. So where does where does the term Palestine even come from?
There we go.
As I'm sure you know, Nicole, the Romans were very clever. They learned from all the prior conquerors. First of all, you can't just, even if you defeat the Jews in battle, you must separate them from the land, Jew from Judea. So not only did they exile us from our land, they changed the name of our land to Palestine. Why? Because who was the mortal enemy of the Jewish people during that time in preceding the conquest of the Romans of that territory? It was the Philistines.
The Philistines.
Who again were, the best way to maybe describe the Philistines, they were like Greek pirates, Mediterranean pirates who had landed on the coast, Ashkelon, the Gaza area, and they were the mortal enemies of the Jewish people. It's important to know that because that's where the term Palestine comes from the Philistines. The Romans were savage. Not only did they, butcher us, sold us into slavery, and then they literally changed the name of our ancestral homeland and named it after the mortal enemy of the Jewish people. Mm-hmm. So that is where the term Palestine came from. I usually start, I do a lot of work in education, Israel education, and I usually start with the Ottoman Empire. So from the 500 years, 600 years preceding World War I, that territory was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. For those who don't know, the Turks. All that's left of the modern day empire is Turkey, with their capital being Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. The Turks referred to this as the Sanjak of Palestine. It was just one area of their entire empire, and the territory that we now call Israel today, or including the West Bank and Gaza, was referred to as Palestine. The people who are advocating to have their own state there now were never at any point in control. And maybe an uncomfortable fact for some people, if the Palestinians as we know them today are to come into sovereignty, a simple basic fact, it will be the first time ever in history, going back as many thousands of years as you want, that they will be the sovereign in that area. So Palestine comes from, we had the Turks lose World War I, and what happens after World War I is this whole idea of nation states. If you looked at a map of Europe before World War I and after, you would be shocked at how many countries you think may have existed that didn't, that were only created in the aftermath of World War I. And
including,
with this whole idea,
sorry to cut you off, including other countries in the region like Syria and Lebanon did not exist previous to that.
Correct.
So the only questionable piece of land over there, of course, has to do with the Jewish state for reasons.
Of course.
That
obvious reasons to you and I.
Right. Obvious reasons to you and I, but for some reason, no one else is able to become self-aware and realize that they are a little bit anti-Semitic when they question the Jewish state, and no other state that existed after that was put into existence during that time.
Conveniently. So the Turks lose World War I, and the British and the French are victors among other countries. But when it comes to the Middle East, when you win war, you get territory. Mm-hmm. And so there was no United Nations. There was the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was given the authority, or had the authority, to decide, what do we do with all this territory? So they decided to give Palestine to the British. And in 1921-22, there was the San Remo Conference where it became official. That is where the League of Nations stated Palestine will be handed over to the British. They will be given a mandate over Palestine, the British mandate for Palestine, to create a national home for the Jewish people. That was the mandate. That is basically what planet Earth had decided to do with that territory. Mm-hmm. Word and deed. So in word, the British were saying, okay, we're going to create a Jewish home. Indeed, they did the opposite. Almost immediately, Nicole, they gave away 77% of what was supposed to be the national home for the Jewish people to Jordan. The Jordanian army was marching north. It was Abdullah going to save his brother, King Faisal, in Syria. The French and the British had just made a deal and carved up the Middle East. The British didn't want any problems with the French, so they said, yo, stop your army. We're going to give you this whole territory. We're going to give you a country. And that became the Hashemite Transjordan, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. That is literally how Jordan was created. Now, I personally love Jordan. I've been there 3-4 times. I love going to Petra. My brother's a dermatologist. He volunteers every summer. He goes into the largest refugee camp in Jordan, in the Middle East, the Zatari refugee camp, pays his own way and volunteers his time to help Palestinian and mostly Syrian refugees in the camp. So I have an affinity for Jordan. I'm telling you this because what I'm going to say is not so kind to Jordan. Jordan is probably the most artificial state created in the Middle East. But as you know, Nicole, no one is ever going to question the legitimacy or the sovereignty of Jordan. Mm-hmm. Only Israel. And I would also end on this, and then, we can continue. As the Middle East was being cut up, as you said, there were just lines being drawn by the British, and they were putting in power whatever interests were served to the British Empire, or what was left of it at that point, never taking into consideration who's on the ground, who is living, who is technically ruling over these territories. I'm talking Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. They drew arbitrary lines, and they put Sunnis in charge of Shiites, Shiites in charge of Sunnis, Christians in charge of Sunnis and Shiites in Lebanon. It doesn't make any sense. Basically, with the Arab uprising in 2011, the Arab Spring, you basically saw the crumbling of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mm-hmm. Sykes-Picot Agreement is the agreement after World War I that carved up the Middle East. Also, I will end with this. When you see a straight line on a country for a border, that's usually a sign of a colonial power, right? Because when you go to Europe or other places, you see borders that don't make sense because they were fighting for every last millimeter of territory. When you see those straight linear lines, that's usually a sign of a colonial power coming and carving up and creating nation states, which is what you have all over the Middle East.
Yeah. So now let's get back to why you love going to Jordan. It's because we made peace with Jordan, right? Correct. So peace is possible, and the Israelis do like peace, and they do want peace, and they don't just use slaughters as an excuse to go in
genocide.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the peace process. Well, before that, actually, I really think it's super important because models like Bella and Gigi Hadid keep posting all this information. And I think Gigi Hadid has like 79 million followers.
Yeah, and unfortunately,
it's just, they keep referring to the Nakba. So if you will, please explain to us what the Nakba is, and please explain to us what the borders look like, and please explain to us who it was that kicked Palestinians out of their land and why. Like, what are they referring to? What are they talking about? Is there truth to it? And is there compassion? Is there room for compassion as well?
Yes, but I want to spend 30 seconds on peace because you brought up a good point. Mm-hmm. Israel made peace with Egypt in 1979 when that leader finally abandoned his obsession with destroying Israel. As soon as that became secondary, peace was possible, and we made peace with Egypt. People forget, like, Jordan was our mortal enemy. We went to war with Jordan. We made peace with Jordan in 3 months without any Western intervention because Hussein finally said, you know what, I'm done too. Mm-hmm. I want peace. And when the leader wanted peace, peace was possible. And then we'll end with, we saw the Abraham Accords. Israel is very capable of making peace with all its neighbors when the leaders of those countries or those peoples are prepared to end their Jew hatred. As you know, and most people don't, it's not about land. It's not about territory. It's about religion. When it ceases to be about religion, peace is possible. And we've seen examples of that. The Nakba, the 1948 war. I find the Nakba fascinating. I've read most books translated into English, certainly the earlier ones. I don't like reading recent books because there's too much revisionist history. I love reading the books that were written soon thereafter. I find them to be more raw and honest and free of a lot of the stuff that we see today. I think the number one misconception, Nicole, about the Nakba is the real catastrophe, which was the Nakba was an Arab land grab. And this is in their own books. Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt wanted to steal all of what was going to be Palestine, and certainly all of Israel. And I think one thing that we forget about is who stole more land from the Palestinians during the Nakba than anybody. Everyone would jump and tell you Israel, but that is factually incorrect. Nobody stole more land from the Palestinians during the Nakba, the 1948 war, Israel's war of independence, than the Jordanians. They were the only ones successful in battle. The IDF lost every battle against the Jordanians. The first time the IDF defeated Jordan in any battle was the Six-Day War. They certainly made up for it in their absolute defeat of the Jordanian army. The Syrians wanted to take all of the north down to Haifa, or the Lebanese. The Syrians wanted the Golan. The Jordanians just wanted the West Bank and Jerusalem. Remember, the Jordanians ruled over Mecca and Medina for millennia. They lost it in World War I because they didn't want to play nice with the British. So they ended up in what's now Jordan. So they wanted another city to be custodian of. So they took Jerusalem. The Egyptians were going to take everything else. I'm going to say something shocking, but I would pose anyone to academically debate the following statement. Had Israel lost the war of 1948, the Nakba, I don't believe there would be any such thing as a Palestinian or Palestinian movement, because all that would have happened if the Jews had lost is Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt would just be larger countries. And if I'm incorrect, you'd have to academically make the case that those countries were somehow going to cede the territory they had won and give it back to the Arabs. From everything I've ever read from the 30s, 40s, 50s, I've read books from Syrian generals, leaders, Jordanian, I've read Hussein Abdullah's memoirs. They were never going to create a Palestinian state. They wanted to enlarge their own territories. The Arabs or Palestinians living would have become either Jordanians, Egyptians, Syrian, Lebanese, depending on where the war ended and where those Arab countries drew the line. The War of 1948 was an Arab land grab, not only of Palestinian land, but an attempt to steal all of Israel. And again, This is coming from their own books, their own words, their own memoirs, their own battle plans.
Okay, so now let's break it down and let's just go in order and keep it organized. 1948, what happens? The British pull out, and then what?
So I would back up a few months from November of 1947 to May of 48, which is the last few months of the British mandate, or when the British had a presence. That was the only time the Palestinians were involved in fighting. That's another thing. This Nakba had nothing to do with the Palestinians. The underground armies, the Lehi, the Irgun, and the Haganah, from November of 47 to May of 48, were fighting against the Palestinians. What were they fighting for? The Jews knew where the Arab countries were going to enter what was going soon to become Israel. So what the Irgun, Lehi, and Haganah were doing was trying to secure what they knew to be all the entry points of the invading Arab armies. They took Haifa, they took Jaffa, and other places to blunt that first blow. The real fighting so once the British left, the Palestinians were out of the entire scenario. That they were done. Then it became a war of Israel with the Lehi, the Irgun, and Haganah forming into one fighting unit, the IDF, fighting against all the invading Arab armies. So the British leave, and once the British leave, you have open warfare.
Can you just explain that real quick? The British leave. Why did the British leave? Like, what does that even mean? The British left. Why?
So that's a great question. The British were given the mandate for Palestine. We already went over that. The British abandoned their mandate in 47.
Thank you very much.
Couldn't handle it anymore, mostly because if you need to know history, right? What was going on in Britain? World War II was over. London, we forget, had been bombed. Their economy is thrashed. Everyone's coming home from war. The British Empire was shrinking. They had all kinds of problems at home. And yet the news every day is what's going on in Palestine. The British are fighting the Arabs. The British are fighting the Jews. Everyone's fighting each other. Soldiers are dying. Why are soldiers dying in Palestine? Why are we spending money in Palestine? The British couldn't take it anymore. As you know, some of the underground armies were giving it to the British,
My
destroying some
grandparents
of their,
were involved
destroying
in
some
that.
of God bless them, destroying their. Remember, we decolonized Palestine, right?
Mhm.
We're colonizers. The colonial power was the British, and it was the Jews who got rid. They decolonized Palestine by forcing the British to leave, which was very beneficial to the Arabs. So, they handed over their mandate because they couldn't take it. They didn't want anything to do anymore. So they handed their mandate over to the United Nations, and then the United Nations decided what to do. I've read some interesting books about the committees that were sent to Palestine. And I think some people forget, they didn't know that they were going to do two states. There were a lot of different permutations on the table of what to do. After they went to Europe, after they went to Palestine, they met with Arabs, they met with the Jews. Then they went back to Lake Success, debriefed, and then they proposed what happened, the partition plan of November of 1947. 2 states for two. That was the first real, you could argue the second two-state. The first was 1937, the Peel Commission. I don't know if you want to go into that, but the real first two-state solution was partition in 1947. The Jews accepted it, the Arabs rejected it.
And okay, so I have heard arguments from old friends of mine now, that
former friends.
yeah, former friends, that the split of land, even though it was, what was it, like 20% for the Jews and 80% for the Arabs, that was proposed at that time. They said even the 20% that the Jews took meant a lot of displacement for the Palestinians. What do you have to say about that?
So that's what was proposed.
And that's why,
and
on those grounds, that's why they rejected that notion.
No, I mean, listen, that's silly. Everybody knows why they rejected it. And I don't disagree with why they rejected it. They rejected it because they rejected any Jewish presence in the land. And they also said, we got all these Arab armies. Why would we accept this when we're just going to kill you and we're going to steal all your land? That's why they rejected it. And you can't really debate against, because that's literally what they were saying. So you can find all kinds of quotes. They weren't, that's no secret.
So the displacement does not take place
until the war started.
Until the war starts.
Until the war started. People have to understand, like, this whole nonsense garbage of land theft, right? We just went over the history. The Turks were in control. The British were in the control. Neither one of those powers were friendly to the Jews. This idea that the Jew coming from Europe was stealing land from an Arab,
as colonizers coming straight from the gas chambers of Europe, weighing 70 pounds, grown men weighing 70 pounds coming out of Auschwitz, arriving on the beaches of Tel Aviv, only to take up in arms to fight for a new country because we decided after 2,000 years we don't want to do this anymore. Because let's talk about land theft for real. After the Jews' land was stolen by multiple empires, what happened to the Jews? They were displaced. They went to every single country on the planet. And then you have the Spanish Inquisition, you have the Crusades, you have the pogroms in Russia, you have the Holocaust. Like, at what point does a nation say enough is enough?
Nicole, there's no, you have to understand that it's by design that we're talking about land theft, genocide, ethnic cleansing. This is the story and the truth of the Jewish people. Right. My mother's family, my mother's grandfather was the largest importer of timber into Iraq. They had a very good life. They've not recovered that wealth or social status to this very day. They lost everything. And my mother's story is not unique. It's the story of all the Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews coming from Iraq, from Yemen, from Lebanon, from Syria. My point is, it's by design that the other side has taken our truths and our narratives and kind of weaponized it against us. It's no coincidence, right, that we're talking about ethnic cleansing. We've been ethnically cleansed from the whole Middle East and the Northern Horn of Africa. We were ethnically cleansed off the face of the European continent. But when we talk about ethnic cleansing, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the 750,000 Palestinians who were displaced or left on their own volition, most of them during the quote unquote Nakba.
Right. And we're
talking about genocide and land. Everything has been stolen from the Jews. Everything that we suffered from, they've stolen and weaponized against us. And it's by design.
It's out of control. And it's also, what's insulting is how you can call people who are literally escaping genocide colonizers.
It's unbelievable. And again, they need to take away our connection to the land, or else their whole platform falls apart. Right? Again,
So like
the
we
fact that we're
came to
Jews
colonize
from
the
Judea,
land.
correct?
Yeah, we
Correct.
came to we never existed there before 1948. We just survived the biggest massacre of Jews known to history. Okay. We arrived there only because we want a place to live. We agree to take 20% for ourselves. They say no. They start a war. Now take us through it. Who attacks? What does it say, first of all, in the Declaration of Independence, the Jewish Declaration of Independence? Do they say we want to fight a war, the Jews?
No. And they actually offered to, treat all citizens that may have fallen, as you know, at all citizens, regardless of creed, ethnicity, free rights. And as you know, there are 2 million Palestinians living in Israel today.
Thank you.
They're most commonly referred to as Arab Israelis. Most people wouldn't even acknowledge that simple, basic fact. That one in every 4 humans that you run into is a Palestinian if you're in Israel.
It's insane. And we're going to get into apartheid in a little bit, but right now let's just continue on with the history of wars and peace negotiations and land for peace and all that jazz. So 1948, the Jews declare independence. They say we want to live side by side in peace, et cetera, et cetera. What happens?
So you have an invasion of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. Now the Palestinians are no longer playing in the sandbox anymore. They're done. And as I stated before, the reason they were done is because those Arab countries, in their own words, in their own text, were coming into Palestine to steal whatever was going to go to the Arabs and to certainly kill and steal all Jewish land and territory that up until that point had been purchased legally. So any territory that Israel had and the state that was created was not on any stolen land. You could not prove otherwise.
And super important, the Jews did not start a war.
They did not start a war.
They
The last thing, as you stated,
war.
What other things people don't understand is because the British were in control, you couldn't immigrate to Israel or Palestine before May. Some people forget about this. The Jews, the survivors of the Holocaust, up until 1948, May, were stuck in the concentration camps. Now, the ovens had been turned off, but that's where all the DPs were living because nobody would take them. So Israel was not interested in war. What they wanted to do was bring every last Jew who had survived the Holocaust back to their ancestral homeland, rehabilitate their souls, their lives, and move on. That was the goal of the Jewish state. She had no desire to fight a war against all those Arab countries.
Okay.
She had no choice.
So now, what land? So the split was according to the United Nations partition plan. The split should have been 20-80 in favor of the Arabs. Because of the war and because of the fact that Israel was attacked by several countries, how much land did they gain in the 1948 war?
So it's interesting. I don't know if I usually hear the opposite, because remember, the Jews were given, as part of the partition, all of the Negev. So I don't know
all
what
of the desert, by the way, just in case anyone wants to know what the negative is. It's desert land.
It's a barren desert wasteland.
Yeah.
At that time, obviously, the Jews have slowly been turning that around, but certainly, yes. I actually hear the opposite accusation, that the Jews only represented X percent and they got a much larger percentage. And that's very misleading, because that larger percentage that they got in the partition, 60% of it was the entire southern Israel, which is just a massive desert.
Well, that's where the 20%, they're referring to livable land.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what was proposed was, again, where the Jews had owned and settled. That's basically what the United Nations said, where the Arabs lived. And again, going back to what we talked about earlier, this was the most legitimate and thoughtful creation of a nation state. They came in, they did all these studies, sent these committees, who's living where, who's ruling over the people that are living here, who's living over there, who's ruling over them. Let's make 2 states for 2 people, and based on where those people are living and who's ruling over them. They really didn't do that anywhere else in the Middle East. The crazy thing, Nicole, is Israel was the most legitimate country created in the Middle East, yet it is the only country on planet Earth whose legitimacy and sovereignty is questioned.
Mm-hmm. It's out of control. Okay, so that's 1948. How much land? What did we gain from those countries that we?
So basically, all that we took was, if you look at a partition map, and maybe you can have it pop up.
Mm-hmm.
There was a southern part of Gaza, so you have Gaza and then a little piece of it south. The Israelis ended up with that. Up
And
north,
that's from which country?
that was supposed to be part of Palestine. Egypt took all of Gaza. All right, and let's not forget that Jordan took the most land from the Arabs, from the Palestinians, by taking the entire West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
Israel was able to push back around the West Bank area as they were pushing the Jordanians back, or whatever militias happened to be operating there. So they got some territory there, and they certainly got some territory that was supposed to be part of Palestine up north when they were pushing the Lebanese and the Syrian armies back beyond the border. But none of that territory equals the landmass that is the West Bank. And another thing, at the end of that war, Yigal Allon was a general who wanted to empty out the West Bank and Gaza.
What do you
Why?
mean?
Because he wanted to push the Jordanians and all Arabs all the way back to the border of Jordan.
And let's talk about that real quick. Historic Israel, the Kingdom of Israel. If you look at a map, and I'll pull it up for everyone. That territory, what you see as Israel today, is just a fraction of what Israel used to be. Correct. From the river to the sea was not where Israel ended. We went past the river all the way into Jordan. And you can literally
east of the river. We were east of the river.
We were east of the river. So that's just a little fun fact. But I want to go back to something that you just said. Did you just say that in 1948 Egypt gained the Sinai Peninsula in Gaza, or did you say
Gaza? Egypt took Gaza.
Took Gaza in 1948.
People forget that from 1948 to 1967, it was the Egyptians who took Gaza. Who did we take Gaza from? Not the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. We took it from Egypt in the 6-Day War. Who did we take the West Bank from? Again, not the Palestinians. Right. They weren't sovereign there. We took it from the Jordanians.
Right. I think it's so important for people to understand this. So that's 1948. Then what happened?
Correct. So eventually the war ends. Israel does win. And the major reason Israel won is because all these countries, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, weren't a cohesive unit. I would argue that if they were fighting on a united front, maybe for the Palestinians, which they were not, they probably would have defeated the IDF. But one of the miracles and there are many miracles of the 1948 war. We could do a whole podcast on the 48 war.
And 67.
And 67.
And 73.
And the Arabs were so divided. That has a major reason why Israel was able to win. There were many times when you read books that the Egyptians needed some support from Jordan. And had Jordan answered their call, it would not have been good for us. Mm-hmm. But they didn't, because again, the Jordanians, all they wanted was the West Bank and Jerusalem. And once they took it, and they took it quickly, they weren't helping anybody. They were going to fortify, and they were done. They were done with the war. So they really screwed over the Egyptians, Lebanese, and the Syrians, because again, they were not a united front. They were all looking to expand their kingdoms, their territories, their states.
Okay. So now what do the borders look like in 1948? A lot of times during the peace process, they refer to, we want to go back to 1947 borders. What does that mean?
Well, usually they see the pre-67 borders, which it means the 48 borders, right? Which would mean that you would have all of the West Bank in control. So when Palestinians say we want pre-67, to your point, they're really saying we want the borders 48. Mm-hmm. They're saying, hey, we want to now accept 75 years later, the deal that we turned down and have turned down God knows how many times since. Now we're ready to accept it. Mm-hmm. Too late. When you lose, you can't dictate terms. The Palestinians, the Arabs, are the only losers in battle in the annals of history that get to come to negotiating tables as if they've won. No other country has ever been allowed that. But again, when you're fighting against Jews, all the rules
all
are
is fair. Yeah.
So to answer your question, basically what they're talking about is the pre-67 borders would have Israel have zero presence in the West Bank. So it would be to dismantle.
And it's called the West
call
Bank because it's technically the West Bank of Jordan,
of the Jordan River.
of the Jordan River.
The West, the Judea and Samaria, as you and I would commonly refer to it, its biblical name, more commonly known as the West Bank, is the West Bank of the Jordan River. And the Jordan River basically runs down the border between Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and the country of Jordan. So when they're saying from the river to the sea, it's the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which is all of Israel. That's what.
And so now Jordan is now in charge of that land from 1948 until
yes, 67.
from 1949, correct, when the war ends.
When the war was over, correct. They had control in 48, but for all intents and purposes, 49 to 67.
And now that piece of land you just referred to, Judea and Samaria, that is in the West Bank. Where do Jews come from?
The West Bank. We basically, that's where we come. That is our, we didn't come from Tel Aviv or Rishon LeZion or Herzliya, Bayam, Chulon. Like so we came from Judea and Samaria. That is our literal,
the literal point where we are the most indigenous to the land.
Correct.
Okay.
But I would also argue now, Nicole, right? Like you have 2-3 million Palestinians living there now: Ramallah, Jenin, Tulkarm, Shechem, Hebron, others I'm forgetting. There's 8 major cities. Like they're not going anywhere. Yeah. We do need to learn how to live with them. We need to stop.
I think they need to learn how to live with us. I think that's the situation.
Correct. That's a more accurate way of putting it.
So now here's the situation. So so now what happens in 1967 then?
In 1967, you have the 6-Day War. Israel was going to be attacked by all the Arabs. A preemptive strike takes place, and without going through the whole history and everything of the 6-Day War, which we can if you want,
let's do it.
To make a long story short, Israel defeats all of the Arab armies in 6 days by striking first. And as a result of that, Israel now, for the first time, comes in control of the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai.
Jerusalem.
She ends up giving the Sinai back and Jerusalem. Correct. It's the first
our capital
time
since the time of King David.
People forget that too, and we're talking about the Old City. The Old City was in control from 49 to 67 by the Jordanians. And some people will say all of Jerusalem is occupied, but the part of Jerusalem that most Jews and tourists know, Israel had that presence the whole time. It was only East Jerusalem and the Old City that Israel came into possession of in 1967 as a result of its victory in the 6-Day War.
There's a famous picture of the soldiers with tears in their eyes that they finally see the Old City in East Jerusalem, because under Jordanian rule, were we allowed over there?
Absolutely not. Not only were we allowed, they were desecrating, they were using ancient gravestones as material to build Arab houses. It was disgraceful what they did to Jewish religious institutions in the Old City during those 20 years. What's also interesting to know, so we end up with all this territory now, right? We have the Golan Heights, we have the West Bank, we have Gaza now, and the Sinai. What is the first thing the Jews try and do? Again, that people want to just paper over or acknowledge as fake news. We wanted to give it all back. There was a euphoria in Israel after the 6-Day War for some that we're finally going to make peace with the Arabs. How could they possibly not make peace with us when we have all this territory to give them? Mm-hmm. So Israel makes the offer. And as you and I know, and maybe some listeners, the Arab League convenes in Khartoum to decide what to do with all this territory that Israel's offering back. And we get something that is critically important to understand because it holds true to, we're in November of 2023, holds true to this very day. And their answer was no peace, no negotiations, and no recognition of Israel. This is literally the 3 famous no's. And the Palestinian Authority essentially toes this line to this. Sometimes they pretend to negotiate. Let's not forget they had Barack Obama in power for 8 years, who would have gotten them the best deal possible. And they refused to negotiate for those 8 years. Don't negotiate. We're a Zionist entity. So they don't, we're not recognized as a sovereign state. Again, no peace. They've been offered peace. That wasn't the first or the last time they were offered peace, as you know, Nicole.
So this happens after 1967, but before we get
Correct.
into that, let's talk. So now we have on the Jordanian side, we have the land that we discussed already, the land that we gained. What happened?
Which is to be specific, which is the entire West Bank. Israel's now controls dislodged. Now Jordan is back within its boundaries of Jordan. They no longer have the West Bank or Jerusalem.
And what happens up north and what happens west?
Syrians get crushed. So then Israel takes the Golan Heights. What was Syria doing with the Golan Heights? Were they cultivating peace and prosperity and farming? No, they were using the high ground to attack Israel. Even before the 6 Day War, they were constantly shelling the farms in the Kibbutzim on the low ground below the Golan Heights. So the Syrians lose the Golan Heights, and the Egyptians get pushed out of Gaza.
Okay. Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula?
And the Sinai. But remember, the Sinai was always part of Egypt.
Right.
And again, Israel tried to give that back immediately, and it was rejected.
So now let's talk about the peace process after 1967.
Well, there's really nothing to talk about, Nicole, because there is no peace process. So, what's maybe interesting to bring up is that there were Jews who were thrilled with the three no's. Specifically, the Jews who had been living in Judea and Samaria, and as a result of the IDF's defeat over and over again in the 1948 war, their families had been massacred, and they had been subject to expulsion from Judea and Samaria back into Israel. So the survivors and the descendants of those families from 48 to 67 always wanted to go back to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And when they saw the Arabs reject that deal, they were thrilled because they saw this now as an opportunity. We control the land now. They clearly don't want it back. We can now go back and resettle where we once were. Forget about even going back biblically where we were 20 years ago.
Right.
So that began the movement of Jews settling in Judea and Samaria.
So now we're talking
after the rejection of that peace.
Now we're talking about another huge taboo word out there: settlements, settlers, etc., etc. When you gain back land after war and decide to build a home there, why are you called a settler?
I hate the term settler. I'll tell you why. If you go to Malay Adumim, Ariel, Efrat, Ramat Shlomo, and I can go on through all, these are not settlements. I grew up in a small town out of Syracuse. Malay Adumim is a much larger city than the one I grew up in, but yet it's called a settlement. Same with Ariel and these other places. Most of the quote unquote settlements lie in, almost all of them, in the 5 settlement blocks. And it's been commonly accepted even by Palestinian leadership that there will never be an evacuation, Nicole, from the 5 settlement blocks. And all of the 600,000 Jews who live in the West Bank, I believe it's like 80-90% live in the 5 settlement blocks. So they're living in territory that's never going to be abandoned. This whole idea of land swaps, we heard about it with Obama and every president. It comes from the simple fact that Israel's never pulling out of the settlement blocks. So what are they going to do? Being a fair partner in any negotiation, they said, okay, you can have some territory here and there, which is really in the northern and southern parts of the West Bank that Israel controls in Israel. They've been offered to give territory to the Palestinians because Israel's never going to pull out of Malay Adumim, Efrat, Ariel. There's no left-wing government that would even advocate for that at this point. It's just never going to happen.
And I know we're jumping the gun here, but could that potentially have to do with the fact that we left the settlements in Gaza?
No question.
Okay.
For many reasons, but there's no question that after the failed Gaza experiment, that was the nail in the coffin for anyone ever even contemplating what happens when Israel evacuates. Let's look at it real quick. It's worth 30 seconds. We pulled out of the Sinai, handed it back over to Egypt.
When did that happen?
In 79. We finally gave it. We made peace with Sadat. Sadat finally said, I'm done with Jew hatred. I want to move on. I care about my people. So he made peace in 79 at Camp David. We got full peace. Not really between the people,
hold on,
certainly...
we're jumping. Let's bring it back. 1967.
Six-Day War. We get all this territory.
We get Gaza, we get the Golan Heights, and we get the West Bank.
Correct. And the Sinai.
And the Sinai Peninsula. That's right. Okay, so now between 1967 and 1973, what happens? I would like to talk about the Yom Kippur War, and I would like to talk about Yasser Arafat. And I would like to talk about King Hussein and Black September.
Got it. So first, let's talk about 67 to 73.
And by the way, audience, we will get to Gaza, but since everyone is always calling for, after we're massacred, people want context, this is the actual context that we're giving you. So here we go.
From 67 to 73, there was no formal war, but if you read any book about that time, there was a war, and they called it the War of Attrition. And it was violent. Constant engagement, sometimes in the sky with Egyptian and Israeli Air Force. We had the Bar-Lev line where we had our fortifications in the Sinai, close to the Egyptian border, constant attacks, raids. The 67 to 73 was a very bloody time between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. It just never, inflamed to a full-on war until October of 1973 with the Yom Kippur War. Very interesting to note, the Yom Kippur War, as you start to really read and dive into it, Sadat started the war because we weren't taking Israel was not taking Sadat or Egypt seriously for peace negotiation. So to get Israel's attention, that was the main motivation for him starting the Yom Kippur War. If you look at his battle plan or anything, he never had a battle plan to go past a certain point in the Sinai. He wanted to take the Sinai back. He wanted the Americans to come in, ceasefire, and then he wanted to start a serious negotiation of peace where Israel would give back all the land, and he was willing to go all the way, embassies, exchange diplomats, and the state of war. So that's what you had between 67 and 73.
And on the eve of Yom Kippur, the most holy day of the Jewish year, who attacks Israel?
The Egyptians.
It's interesting because it's also right off the heels of the 1972 Munich Olympics and
Correct.
Several other hijackings and terrorist plots to kill the Jews, and which brings us to Black September, which is what's happening around this time as well. So talk about Black September and King Hussein, please. This is right before the Yom Kippur War.
Yom Kippur War. So basically, you have the Palestinians living in the West Bank and really now in Jordan, because Israel takes the West Bank in 67, correct? So all the militant Palestinians are now in Jordan. What are they doing in Jordan? The same thing they would end up doing in Lebanon years later. They're creating a state within a state.
And who is the leader
Hussein's Yasser Arafat, an Egyptian named Yasser Arafat. So he is now the leader of the militant, the PLO, which is a terrorist organization.
The Palestinian Liberation Organization, but mind you,
created in 1964.
At this point, they are conquered by. This is after 1967. This is them being conquered by Jordan, not by the Jews.
Well, they were conquered by Jordan first, and then when we took the West Bank in the Six-Day War, they're now in Jordan.
Okay.
And they're creating a state within a state. And it's becoming a huge problem. Hussein in his memoirs wrote that he was visiting, things were getting bad. He didn't want to act on the Palestinian sensitive issue, He kept holding back. He goes to visit a military base. And instead of the Jordanian flag flying, he had women panties or bra. It was one or the other. I don't remember which. But one of them was flying instead of the Jordanian flag. And as he wrote in his book, he starts freaking out. If you're an Arab leader and you start to lose the security service or the army, your rule is done. He decided right then and there that he had to act. So after visiting that base where the the flag was not there and it was the women's undergarments flying instead of the flag, he unleashed the army against the Palestinians.
And
in
this
September of 1970.
And this is after several assassination attempts on his life.
Correct.
And several
Good point.
And several terrorist attacks carried out internationally in Europe that he was getting flack for because it was being organized from his territory.
It was always emanating from Jordan.
Thank you.
And so he slaughters the Palestinians.
Slaughter
the
Palestinians?
Yes.
How many?
I've seen numbers north of 20. I've seen numbers 10 to 15. He slaughtered tens of thousands. It's more than 10. Is it less than 20? I don't know if there's a real accurate number out there. He slaughtered more than 10,000 Palestinians, drove that unit, all their followers and people, out of Jordan. The Syrian army deploys forces on the border because the Syrians say, you're not coming into our country. Obviously, Israel had a presence, so they weren't going to be able to enter into Israel. So they're driven out and end up in Lebanon. And they do the same shit in Lebanon, completely destabilize it, create a state within a state. And then you have the Maronite Christians who are ruling in Lebanon. They kept inviting Ariel Sharon, whining and dining him, begging him to deploy the IDF and rid Lebanon of the disease known as the PLO. And that's what led to the First Lebanon War. And Israel did successfully defeat the Palestinians and exile them to Tunisia. And we were going to get full-on peace with Lebanon, but the Palestinians end up killing the Christian leader, Bashir Gemayel, who was definitely going to make peace with Israel. And he gets murdered. Then you have the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which is revenge. The Palestinian camp where it wasn't the Jews who were killing the Palestinians. It was the Phalangist party who was pissed that their guy got killed. So they went and massacred all these Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila camp, which the IDF was guarding and was in control of security. They did let them in and are guilty of that. Obviously,
which is
they get
fucked
accused
up,
of the slaughter.
and we can both say that.
Absolutely. They should have been more, they should have understood that that was a bad idea, letting those dudes in.
Okay, so now we have Yom Kippur War, 1973, attacked by Egypt. We've got King Hussein slaughtering Palestinians in 1972, 1971, 72.
1970. Because remember, Black September is September of 1970. That's where the terror group who killed all the Jews in the Munich massacre, they got their name from Black September. That was the
Black September.
From that event.
That was a fringe terrorist
from Jordanians
organization
slaughtering Palestinians.
Right. And they decided to go and slaughter Israeli Olympic players in the Olympic Games on German soil in Germany.
In Germany.
The second time, Jews being killed in Germany. Golda Meir's famous quote. So this leads us to, now let's just talk about in 1973, the land. What happens to the land in 1973, the Yom Kippur War? And then we'll get to Israel, the First Lebanon War.
So not much changes, but a lot will change as a result, right? Israel ends up defeating all the armies. And she, at the end of the Yom Kippur War, she's in charge of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, still has the Golan, and ends up taking the Sinai. Mm-hmm. But that began the diplomatic process that led to 1979, where Israel makes peace with Egypt and ends up giving Egypt back the Sinai. Now, Israel tried to give Gaza back to Egypt, but Egypt refused for the second time to take Gaza back again. If you read any books about Camp David in 79, it actually, the agreement opened the door for Gaza to go back to the Palestinians, but it was just, again, wholly rejected. Sadat ends up getting murdered for making peace with the Jews. For making peace
with Israel. He gets assassinated.
And not only that, Egypt, the pretty much the leader of the Arab League, gets thrown out of the Arab League again for making peace with the Jews. So the First Lebanon War is really just Israel going in to get rid of the Palestinians on behalf of the Christians, but also on behalf of Israel, because what was happening in the north? You think the Palestinians were just terrorizing the Lebanese? No, they were terrorizing the Jews living in the northern. They took over a school. People forget, I think it was in Ma'alot. You had Sandy Hook in northern Israel in the 70s. These savage, sadistic death cult losers went into a preschool and were killing little kids. They were launching rockets, cross-border attacks. So Israel saw it not only as an opportunity to get rid of the Palestinians by helping the Lebanese, but also ending all the cross-border and making peace. We can make peace with Lebanon. How incredible would that be?
And what organization is taking credit for these atrocities from Lebanon?
The PLO.
This is the PLO.
PLO, Fatah, so Black September,
This is not the government of Lebanon.
No. You know, Lebanon has always suffered, right? they had to deal with the Palestinians, and now you don't have the PLO, but you have Hezbollah, which is even worse.
Exactly.
And they created a political party. So not only are they a terrorist organization occupying your southern country, but they've taken over your parliament.
Mm-hmm.
Taken over your parliament. The Iranians, I live in Great Neck, so I know Persians very well. They are extremely clever. There's just there's no debate there.
Yeah. Okay, so now that happens in 1982, and now let's move into, am I forgetting something? What's happening before that, between that and the first?
No, I think the only thing I would say is Israel never had settlements in Lebanon, but they did maintain 4 or 5 bases in southern Lebanon up until 2000. And it was in 2000 that Ehud Barak unilaterally shut down the bases and pulled out every last soldier over the border. People are praising but what did that lead to, Nicole? When we you asked a question earlier, like every time we give up territory, right? We gave up Gaza, Hamas, Iran. You give up the Sinai Peninsula. You have Iran, and every other dirtbag terrorist organization on planet Earth has a presence in the Sinai. We pulled out of southern Lebanon. What happened? Iran, Hezbollah. If we pulled out wholesale the West Bank, like idiots think that, there's just going to be peace and all these good things are going to happen to the Palestinians. What are you reading? What are you seeing? What history do you know that would lead you to believe that Israel pulling out of the West Bank and leaving security to the Palestinians is a good thing?
Yeah.
Especially today, Hamas would take over in minutes, hours, maybe a day. Hamas would have entire control.
They did. They did already in Gaza. It took them 10 seconds here. After the second Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War in 1982, what is the situation in terms of who is governing land and who is living where, and what are the demographics? Like, how could, where is Yasser Arafat even? Where is he operating out of?
So that's a very good question. So let's go very quickly. In Lebanon, Israel this is after the first Lebanon War. In defeating the Palestinians, Israel exiled them to Tunisia. So to answer your first question, the leadership of the Palestinian movement is now living and exiled in Tunisia. They wouldn't come back until the ending of the Oslo. So that's where they are. Israel has administrative and security control since 1967, up until the time you're talking about, mid to late 80s, of the Gaza Strip. So Israel is ruling in the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians living there, and Israel also has administrative and full security control over the entire West Bank when the first Intifada takes place.
Okay, and Yasser Arafat and Palestinian leadership from Tunisia
are pulling the strings from Tunisia.
Pulling the strings from Tunisia, and there are attacks from the West Bank and Gaza, from the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Yasser Arafat calls an uprising, aka Intifada, and they start attacking by stabbings, suicide bombings, etc., etc., etc.
Correct. And this doesn't come to an end until in 88. It started by a kid getting run over by a military
child being run over by a Jew.
I think he was killed.
Okay.
Yes.
We don't know if
and again, we know that they didn't do it on purpose, but a child did die and he was hit by a Jeep. This is all true. They spin it as, these soldiers saw a little kid, slammed on the accelerator and killed him on purpose.
Right.
As you and I know, that certainly isn't the case, but a child did die as a result of a military Jeep running him over.
And so
I believe he was backing. I believe they were backing up and hit him. I forget the entire story, so I don't really want to, but I know a kid was hit by a Jeep, and that was the spark.
Okay. And at this point, the Israelis have complete security control over Gaza and the West Bank. Since 1967.
Since 1967, correct.
Okay. And at this point, several peace negotiations were denied.
Well, listen, you had 67 that was denied. They weren't there yet. There was peace offered in 67. There was an opportunity in 79 for Gaza, and correct, but in 67, Israel makes peace with Gaza in 79, And that year of the Intifada, interesting, I never made that connection. If we have the dates right, of 88, it's when Jordan said, hey, we abandoned all territory claim to the West Bank.
Okay, so I think that actually is very relevant.
Yeah, I never connected that dot.
Because they're in essence, what they're saying is just like the British, like, we're done here, we're out.
Yeah, we don't want any part of that anymore.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the first Intifada ends around 1993 with the Oslo Accords, and that is when Yasser Arafat, and the rest of the Palestinian leadership, who has been exiled to Tunisia, now comes back and is offered what?
They're offered control that basically ends the Israeli occupation, right? Up until this point, Israel not only had a security presence, but was ruling over, because again, she took it over in the 1967 war, tried to give it back. There was nobody to give it back to. So Israel had been stuck from 67 to 93 ruling over the Palestinians. So as a result of Oslo in the West Bank and Gaza, what Oslo allowed for both the Palestinians and Israelis is to start to hand over control from Israel to the Palestinians
because the Jordanians
were out.
Were out, and they already just said, we have no more claim to this land. We don't want to deal with this.
Correct. And the Egyptians made it clear from the very beginning that they never wanted to take us back.
Okay, so these are two very important facts. The Jordanians, when the term occupation is used in this context, we're talking about the occupation of the piece of land in the West Bank and the piece of land in Gaza that was offered back to the Jordanians and back to the Egyptians, both of which rejected. And you can call Gaza and the West Bank an Israeli problem that they had. They were facing atrocities and slaughters from every direction with the first Intifada. A lot of hatred. The Jews now are living in quote unquote settlements in those areas in Gaza and in the West Bank, which we disagree with the term settlement. It's just another name for neighborhood.
In some cases in the West Bank, it's another term for cities.
Massive city.
These are cities.
Yeah. And so at this point, with the Oslo Accords, who facilitated the Oslo Accords, and now tell us again what happened. So that effectively ends the Israeli occupation, quote unquote.
Correct.
Well, in the correct term, occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Correct. Basically, what Oslo accomplished is, for people who are really dialed in, when you look at the West Bank, you see it in three zones, three areas: Area A, Area B, and Area C. And I'm sure you're gonna have a beautiful map that will show the viewers areas A, B, and C. Mm-hmm. Area A, think of it as all, meaning, right, Area A is where the 8 major cities, Palestinian cities are.
This is the West Bank specifically.
I'm talking about the West Bank, Area A, where the 8 major cities are, and it's where the Palestinians have A for all control, administrative and security. Right? What some people don't understand is they keep saying that we're occupying the West Bank. Does Israel have a security presence in the West Bank? There's no doubt. And if your definition of occupation is Israel having any security presence in that territory, then okay, you can call that occupation. That's your own definition of occupation. Israel's not occupying the Palestinians, as you know, Nicole, in front of all those 8 major cities where most of the Palestinians live. There's a big red sign in Hebrew and in English and in Arabic. It basically says, I'll summarize it for the viewers, no Jews allowed. Mm-hmm. The only Jews that go into any of those cities are very highly trained special units when they need to go get people who are a threat to Jewish security, are planning or have acted out against the Jews.
Okay, but Ron, we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, I want to talk about Oslo. Are you saying that it was broken down into A, B, and C?
B and C. Correct. So Area A is they have complete control, but Israel can go into Area A only when there is a specific threat. If there are no threats, you will see no Jews, you will see no IDF, nothing. It's all administered law. You don't like the laws there too? We may get to that and when we get to apartheid. You don't like the laws in the West Bank? Then your address is not Israel, because Israel does not rule or create laws in Area A. That is the Palestinian Authority.
Okay, so now
the PLO basically changed their name, right? It'd be like saying, like, we were going to go make peace with Taliban, and we just changed the name from Taliban to the Afghan Authority.
Right.
That's basically what happened with the Palestinian Authority. They were the PLO. We needed to change the name. So the Palestinian Authority came into existence. It's basically the same people from the PLO, and they are now given control in Area A and Area. Now in Area B, they have administrative control, but not security control.
Okay.
Area C is entirely under Israel administratively and security. And there's a lot of barren land in Area C, and that's where the 5 settlement blocks are,
In
all
Area C.
domiciled within Area C. And there's interesting to note, there's about 100 to 150,000 or so Palestinians who live in Area C.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be worth noting that, you're never going to see a real pro-Palestinian person talk about this, but there's some criticism you could have in Area C where Israel's ruling over these Palestinians. Now, if you're a Jew living in Malay Adumim, Ramat Rachel, Efrat, any of the 5 settlement blocks in Area C, you are subject to Israeli law. If you are a Palestinian living in that same Area C, you are not subject to Israeli law. You are subject to Jordanian military law. So in that area, you have one government in control, but technically you do have 2 different sets of laws. Why Jordanian military rule?
Geneva Convention.
Because under international law, Nicole, when you take over a territory, you need to maintain whatever law was there beforehand. What was the law before Israel acquired the territory or took the territory in the 6-Day War? Jordanian military law.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much for explaining that. So that since 1993, the PLO becomes the PA. It's run by Yasser Arafat. The Palestinian Authority is now governing their own people in the West Bank and also in the Gaza Strip.
And in Gaza, correct. He goes into Gaza, and it's funny, there's a Shin Bet interview with maybe Avi Dichter, I forget who was in control at that time. He violated Oslo the very first day. There were people who were not allowed to enter, terrorists that they had exiled, that were not allowed to be allowed back into the territory. He smuggled one of the most well-known terrorists in his car.
Mm-hmm.
The IDF security forces caught him at the border, and they didn't know what to do because they had just signed Oslo, and they were told by the Shin Bet and the Mossad, let him go in.
Mm-hmm.
I believe they got the terrorist he smuggled in later, but he violated the agreement from the very start. He was never really interested in making peace. If you knew Arafat, again, we talked about it before, he just wanted a way back in. He just wanted to come back.
And money. Let's talk about how much money he died with.
Oh, God. Billion. He was a billionaire.
He was a billionaire.
He died a billionaire.
Yeah. Okay, so now that's 1993. Great.
Correct.
Now, why does he start the Second Intifada?
The Second Intifada, so you're jumping a little bit. So in 1993, you have Oslo. Oslo was supposed to be temporary. I think it's worth, Nicole, discussing that. It's important to understand that Oslo was supposed to be a bridge to a final state, so meaning a two-state solution. So Oslo was the beginning. It laid out the framework of what both sides needed to do over a certain time period, which would end up resulting in 2 states for 2 people. And it was a mess. They start sending in suicide bombs, blowing up buses. Rabin gets murdered. Then Bibi has a round of power temporarily for a year or 2 before Barak comes in. And both sides certainly were not living up to their ends of the bargain. More so the Palestinians, and I'm not trying to be a homer here, but they were literally sending suicide bombers, blowing up buses within a year or 2 after Oslo, trying to derail everything. So
it was on a weekly basis.
And Oslo wasn't meant to be permanent. And it became, we're literally living under Oslo today, because when you go to the West Bank, it's areas A, B, and C 20, 30, 40 years later. And that's not how it was implemented. It was implemented, okay, here are some first steps, and then we'll end up with a Palestinian state living side by side a Jewish state.
Right. So
but we never got there.
How it should go is, okay, this is the framework. This is the groundwork. These are the 2 main pieces of land that you guys are going to have. We're going to set you guys up to have your own government. We're going to set you guys up to have your own piece of land, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of that taking place in the West Bank and Gaza, the Second Intifada happens.
Well, let's back up again. So what you have is, let's get to the Second Intifada.
Okay.
So Oslo is a failure. Rabin gets killed. Bibi comes into power. Then you have Ehud Barak come into power. then Ehud Barak offers the Palestinians everything.
Mhm.
The most criminal thing, and I think one of the things that these idiots in the street will never acknowledge or understand, that everything they're fighting for, free Palestine and all this bullshit, was offered to them in 2000 by Ehud Barak in Camp David again with
Bill
Clinton. Now, what was
Clinton.
offered? 97% of the West Bank, East Jerusalem as the capital, $30 billion in cash, connecting Gaza and the West Bank. I think it was 100 to 150,000 refugees allowed to return, not 6 million.
The right of return,
And
Jerusalem
all
is the
kinds of other
capital,
stuff, yeah,
all that
and
jazz.
all kinds of other stuff that I'm missing out. And by the way, anyone who even questions this, PBS recorded this. They did a documentary about this. It's called Elusive Peace. And if you are interested in this criminal offense of rejecting this, the Palestinian leadership rejecting this offer, it has all been videoed, recorded, and you can watch it. Elusive Peace. Highly recommended.
And Bill
So,
Clinton, his famous quote is that Arafat was here for like 10 days and said no to everything.
everything. And when you watch Elusive Peace, Nicole, it's crazy how excited Clinton got when the Israeli, he thought, in his own words, he's like, I thought they were going to offer a few insignificant outlier settlements, and we would try and get more from there, but that's all we were going to get. When Barack offers everything, he couldn't wait to go to Arafat and say, look what I got you.
Mm-hmm.
I got you 97% of the West Bank, blah, 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 blah. It was rejected, and that ends up leading to the Second Intifada. What started happening after that rejection is, for the first time, you really started to see the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, come out and criticize the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
How could you turn down this deal? They start to criticize Arafat. He starts to lose credibility. So what does he do? He starts the Second Intifada. You know, they'll tell you that it was Ariel Sharon going to visit the Temple Mount. That certainly didn't help.
Mm-hmm.
But an Intifada was coming. The Intifada did start with Sharon doing that, the rejection of this deal that led to a lot of, again, violence, blood, and then we end up with 2005, where Israel ends up unilaterally disengaging from the Gaza Strip.
So this happens before we get to 2005. I just want to make it clear that a security fence goes up in the West Bank.
Correct. What was happening? Let me give your listeners.
So this is for the listeners that are talking about blockades and, you know, they don't have freedom of movement, etc. Let's talk about the reasons why.
Correct. They did. And then you had in 1 month, I think you had 56 terror attacks in 1 month. And the way I like to explain that to people is there are 52 weeks in a year. Imagine if you were a country and you had one terror attack every week for an entire year. Now let's go to Israel. You had what I just explained happen in 30 days. Forget about a week, for a year, in 30 days. The Second Intifada was violent. It was bloody. And Israel didn't have the hurdles that you have now today to go through. It was a result of the Second Intifada. And the wall. First of all, the wall that you see is only 3%. Most people don't know that. You know, they're only going to show you that one part of the wall that is a giant cement barrier, and with all the graffiti and idiot Roger Waters, and Banksy has his thing on it.
Banksy and all those idiots.
That's only 3% of the wall. Why? Because the Palestinians were using sniper rifles to kill Jews or fire bullets in that section. So the Israelis erected a wall to block the bullets. You go to the other 97% of the wall, it's a barbed wire fence that has all kinds of sensors, but it's just a barbed wire fence.
And it's also important to note that suicide bombings decreased by 50% every single year.
It was huge. Let me give you a very short analogy that I got from a senior IDF intelligence guy. I think he articulated the wall beautifully. Before the wall and the checkpoints, 1 + 1 = 2. It's the way he put it. One crazy suicide bomber, one driver, you could go right into Israel, do whatever you wanted. After the wall and the checkpoints, 1 + 1 = 11, meaning now you needed a network to pull off that same action. And the Shin Bet and everyone else was so good that once you needed 4, 5, 6, 7 guys, they would be able to prevent it. It was just so much harder. And because of the security and the effectiveness of the Shin Bet and other units, it was able to, like you said, I don't know the exact number, but it was absolutely profound, the decrease in terror attacks as a result of bringing of erecting checkpoints and the wall.
Yeah. So this is for those of you who are accusing Israel of apartheid, etc. Let's just make it super clear that the Palestinians that are living inside Israel with citizenship have full equal rights to the
They have
Jewish
Israeli
people,
passports.
and
They
everyone else
vote in
that lives
Israeli
there.
elections.
They have seats in parliament. They're judges on their Supreme Court justices.
Supreme Court.
Thriving businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
55% of all pharmacists in Israel are Palestinian.
There we
They
go.
share medical departments, hospitals,
Yeah.
again, within the sovereign state
This is
of
within
Israel.
the sovereign state of Israel. So now when you are referring to, oh, there's a wall, et cetera, number one, and you're classifying that as one of the reasons why you believe that there is apartheid in Israel, that's not true. Number one, it's a security fence and it helped save lives. And number two, we are now talking about the area that the Jews do not govern. It was
Correct.
set up for the Palestinians to have a state. And now this is referring to the West Bank and Gaza. Now, let's get to Gaza. Ron, take it away. What happened?
So in 2005, Ariel Sharon is in power, and he wants to pull out of Gaza. Why? For many reasons. First, the population, again, we get accused of genocide. The population in Gaza was exploding. He didn't want to rule over all those Palestinians. Number two, he felt that if a war was ever coming, we didn't have settlements, if we didn't have any Jews there, that Israel would be able to affect a better military strategy if we didn't have to worry about Jews living in settlements or cities within Gaza. Number three, he met with the king of Jordan and Bush, and they basically said, okay, if you're going to disengage from Gaza, it's called the Bush-Sharon letter, you can build in the West Bank, in the 5 settlement blocks. We're going to recognize that not as Israeli territory. We're going to recognize that, all right, these major cities you're not coming out of. We're not going to bother you anymore. When you build, you can build up, not out. So as long as these cities don't expand and continue to encroach on what could be Palestinian territory, you're okay. And there were other reasons too. So Sharon decides to pull every last Jew out. So when you come to, I don't forget what month it was, but
setting it up for a Palestinian state. Yeah.
Correct, to be independent. So Israel in 2005 dismantles all the settlements and pulls every last Jew and IDF soldier that had a presence in the Gaza is now gone.
And that is not to be taken lightly.
Clearly.
And that is not to be taken lightly. There's footage of what goes on. Your own government is pulling you out of your home. And as a soldier, there were soldiers crying as they are forcibly removing Jews out of their home.
Dragging Jews. They are dragging Jews.
Literally dragging them in the streets out of their homes and businesses, thriving businesses, just to give this land back to Palestinians. So if you want to talk about displacement, let's talk about that as well.
There's a movie, a documentary called Unsettled, and I would urge your viewers, especially with what's going on in Gaza now, to watch it. And you will literally see the disengagement of Gaza live. I actually know the guy who made the movies from Syracuse. His name's Adam Hudnik. He went into Gaza and he hit record. And you see Jewish soldiers dragging Jews out of Gaza. And you know what's crazy, Nicole? Some of them were saying the following: you guys are crazy. I'm talking about the people who are living in Gaza were telling me, you guys are crazy. You're going to get missiles in Ashkelon and Ashdod. They're going to come and massacre you in Netivot and Sderot. They literally predicted what ended up happening before October 7th and what happened on October 7th. And this is in 2005 as they're being pulled out. Unfortunately, they were correct. Pulling out of Gaza was a mistake for Israel. It was an even bigger mistake for Israel ending, and I know this will sound insane to some people, but once Israel ended its occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and it's again not up for debate, the quality of life in almost every metric measurable for the Palestinians just plummeted because we handed control over to Arafat and other horrible actors, and it was just, forget about Israel. It was terrible for the Palestinians. So we pull out, and Bush insisted on having elections in Gaza after Israel disengaged. And I think it's one of the very few things, Nicole, that the Palestinians and Israelis ever agreed upon. which was we should not hold elections. They said, hey, there's this terror group that could win. Bush insisted. So they have elections. And unfortunately, Hamas wins. Hamas then goes and starts killing the Palestinian Authority. They're exiled out into the West Bank. And then they start importing, attempting to import weapons from Iran on these massive tanker ships via the port. Now, the Israeli Navy SEALs intercepted all these ships. After the third, fourth, fifth ship, whatever, Israel enacts a naval blockade that is in place to this very day.
Very important fact. This is something
There
that
was
Israel
no
was
naval
accused
blockade in 05 or 06. It wasn't until 07. It wasn't even after the first ship. But after all these ships, it was clear that Israel cannot allow imports to come in unchecked to Gaza for obvious reasons, for people whose brains aren't infected with anti-Semitism. So what did Israel do? Enacts a naval blockade. All that stuff still gets into Gaza, but it has to land in Ashkelon or Ashdod, has to be inspected, put on a truck, and then busted. Are we doing this to make Palestinians suffer? Are we doing this to brutalize them, so on and so forth? No. We're doing this to prevent the kind of weaponry that Hezbollah now has pointed at Israel to get into the hands of Hamas. If you want to end the naval blockade, if you want to open up the port, the dialogue and discussion needs to center around how do we make sure that weaponry used to kill massive amounts of Jews will not be used when that blockade ends.
Okay.
The other side never wants to acknowledge that, talk about that, think about it.
Yeah. Which brings us to our modern day conflict. Before we get to October 7th, 2023, since Hamas took power in Gaza, how many times have they launched rockets? How many missiles? How many people have died? How many operations how many retaliation operations have gone down from the Israeli side? How many Palestinians have suffered? And yeah, let's just start with that.
All right, listen, I'm not going to go through every conflict, but as we know, it's basically every 2 to 3 years. As Hamas becomes irrelevant, as they start to lose credibility in Gaza, or other geopolitical events will determine when they need their own people to die. And when they need their own people to die and they need more money, they will launch rockets. Now, they know that if they launch 5 or 6 rockets or 10 rockets, that Israel's not going to respond. But they know once you start launching 100 plus rockets a day, any sovereign country, Western or not, will respond. So every 2 to 3 years, they will cross that red line, and that will result in an Israeli response. Now, as the Palestinians are being brutalized, subjugated, killed for lack of civil liberties, nothing. I mean, it's just horrific what the sadistic death cult known as Hamas does, not only to Jews, but to their own people. Nobody cares. No one will say a word about what happens. But as soon as a Jew is involved in any way, shape, or form, the whole world loses their mind. So thousands of Palestinians have died, not only as a result of Israel's retaliation, but they're dying on a daily basis based on Hamas. You're not towing the line of Hamas, or you're being accused of being gay, or a collaborator with Israel, or for any reason whatsoever, you can be put to death at any given moment in Hamas, in Gaza, as a result of Hamas's brutality. They destroyed the Gaza Strip. It should have been a Singapore. You know, Nicole, all the times you've been to Israel, we know what that Mediterranean coastline looks like in Israel. Yeah. It's the same beach that we go to in Tel Aviv, in Gaza. And it's just horrific and upsetting for people like us who do care about Palestinians, where we just see all the pro-Palestinian support whitewash and dust under the rug the brutality of Hamas. How can you be pro-Palestinian and not loathe and be completely consumed with the brutality that Hamas dishes out against their own people?
So this is
like
what
they're literally being called a resistance movement, by liberal people. It's the world has gone mad.
The world has gone mad, and that's, I think, really super important. The Jews are also technically pro-Palestinian. You know, by getting rid of Hamas, you're pro-Palestinian. I think that people
absolutely,
it's about time that people realize that and really understand that. Now, I just want to move into anti-Semitism real quick. What are the implications of saying ceasefire?
Ceasefire
When someone
will
says
mean,
it's not anti-Semitic to say ceasefire,
oh God. I mean,
what
listen,
do you have to say about
a
that?
ce- what I have to say, a ceasefire will result in Hamas regaining entire control over the Gaza Strip. It will mean that they can prepare again, as they say in their own words. So if anyone's going to say what I'm about to say isn't true, then you need to tell me why these people aren't saying and doing exactly what I'm about to say. They will again and again and again commit the horror that they did on October 7th. This is them in their own words. And not only will they do that again against the Jews, they will continue to brutalize the innocent Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. They will rob them blind of all their resources. They will create no schools, no hospitals, no infrastructure. They've obliterated the water. There's Gaza's sitting on an aquifer, but yet all the pipes that run the water throughout Gaza have been used for rockets. And then they blame Israel, saying that, the 6% of the water that Israel does supply, it's all Israel's fault. A ceasefire will be brutal for both the Palestinians and the Israelis. Most people who are advocating for this are either anti-Semitic or just don't understand the reality that is Hamas and the Gaza Strip. If you are pro-Palestinian, you couldn't possibly advocate for Hamas remaining in power. How is that good for the, forget about Israel, let's just put that to the side. How is that good for the Palestinians?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody brutalizes the Palestinians worse than Hamas. Lebanon is the second, but a far second.
Mm-hmm. And by Lebanon, you mean Hezbollah in Lebanon?
No, I mean Lebanon. Lebanon is an apartheid state. Lebanon has their own laws that only
brutalizing
apply
the
to
Palestinians.
Palestinians.
That's right. They're not even
Palestinians,
allowed to
correct.
go to specific hospitals, etc.
Hospitals, schools, they're barred from, again, because there are no Jews in Lebanon, nobody cares. But
Nobody
if you
cares.
care about, if you're listening to this and you care about Palestinian apartheid, your number one focus should be in Lebanon, where they practice brutal apartheid against the Palestinians. They are literally, it's textbook apartheid, two sets of laws. If you're Sunni, Shiite, Alawite, whatever, Maronite Christian, you are subject to Lebanese law, and if you're a Palestinian, it's a different, more brutal set of laws. Again, they don't have access to public health system, schools, and certain professions. They can't own land. It's really bad. But no Jews in Lebanon, so
no one cares.
Nobody cares.
And then can you please just lastly explain why when people say stop the occupation and stop the genocide, what does that really mean? Because when we had this conversation over the phone, I was trying to tell you that I really thought that ignorance may have been part of all of this. If I could just educate people on what's really going on and what it really means, etc. And I had conversation with now former friends, and I give them historical lessons, and I give them, all these facts, and they say to me, stop spreading your propaganda. It's frustrating. And it's really
It's very
sad. And then
frustrating.
they'll repost something like stop the genocide or stop the occupation. Can you please explain to those people what they're really, in essence, what they're really saying?
Listen, as we know through our own history, that it starts in word and ends in deed, right? And the words that are happening now we're already seeing it, Nicole. It's already starting. When you are yelling that Israel is an apartheid state, that she ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, even though there's 2 million Palestinians living in Israel, that we stole all this land, which we already touched upon, that we're occupying, so on and so. This is modern day anti-Semitism. It's simply not true. We're not occupying Ramallah, Jenin, Tulkarm. Do we have a military presence? Are some things going on at these checkpoints not okay? Yes. But why can't we be honest about it? Why can't pro-Palestinian activists or anyone who cares about them be more honest about the real issues the Palestinians face? Why? Because of anti-Semitism. What I tell everyone that I lecture at is no offense, Nicole. I tell them not to do what you do with your friends. Like, I would advocate for any one of my friends that supports the Palestinians to continue supporting them. Do it free of anti-Semitism. If you think if apartheid is your thing, you're right. You should be fighting against and speaking out against apartheid in Lebanon. If your thing is occupation, Israel has ended its occupation over where all these Palestinians live. Israel since 1947, 48, 60, we've gone over some of it. She's been trying to give all the land back, trying to end its occupation. There's nobody to give it to. They keep rejecting these offers with no counteroffer.
And
So
it's
if you
also
want
the
this occupation to
occupation,
end,
and it's also the occupation of other countries, not the occupation
no
of this
question.
place called Palestine. And in addition to that, when people in these pro-Hamas rallies, if you want to call it pro-Palestinian rallies, say end the occupation, they are obviously, as you now know, since we spent an hour and a half talking about the different pieces of land that were occupied, when and where, from who, etc. The term end the occupation does not mean end the occupation in Gaza. It does not mean end the occupation in the West Bank. It means the destruction and the annihilation of the state of Israel. You are calling for a genocide of the Jewish people when you say that.
Yeah.
Just to be
And not
clear.
to point out the obvious, Nicole, like if you really want to end the occupation, and that's the hill you want to die on because you love the Palestinians, you need to put pressure on the party that is preventing the end of the occupation. Like, again, it can only be explained by anti-Semitism. You have one party in control that has, for a half a century now, tried to give the territory back, even under crazy circumstances like Oslo, literally said, you know what, we're just going to give these terrorists control of this territory. No other country would have done what Israel did. But yet Israel still gets blamed as being the reason why they're still in occupation or that Palestinians are suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want this to end, put pressure on the Palestinian leadership and all this will end. It will solve all your problems.
Mm-hmm. I think the bottom line here is that they need new leadership. And I don't think that the bottom line
No
is
question. That would change so much. Like if you could wave your wand and you said you could change one thing by changing Palestinian leadership, getting someone more moderate, if that person even exists, who's not obsessed with the end of Israel, but is obsessed with the prosperity and the future of the Palestinian people, you could achieve that goal and you could achieve it quickly. No doubt.
And
I
if
hope
you
in my
do feel
lifetime we
bad
see
for
that.
them, if you do feel bad for the Palestinian people, you should feel bad for them.
Yeah, they are suffering. They are being exploited. They do have a narrative. It just doesn't have anything to do with all the things that they're peddling in mainstream media on the streets of New York or wherever.
Their suffering is being exploited as an excuse to ethnically cleanse the Jews and get rid of the Jewish state. And that is a fact. And they're being exploited by their leadership, and they have been exploited by their leadership, and their leadership continues to do so. And I think the only way is to get rid of Hamas, and that's exactly what we're trying to do.
It's funny, that would be it's a very pro-Palestinian thing that the IDF is doing and getting rid of.
The IDF is like, we're gonna get rid of them. That's it.
Yeah.
And it's been 20 years of us trying not to go into Gaza because the last thing the Israelis want to do is lose ground troops and our boys. And that's what happens when we go into Gaza. So
no question.
Yeah. Anyway,
okay.
Ron, is there something you want to end with?
My last remarks would be, listen, to all of our friends out there. I would again, I think I said this before, but I want to say it again. We should stop trying to get people to love and support Israel, even though I would love that. And that's how I feel because I've been there and I've been going there my whole life. And I probably know more than most people, not only from reading all these books, but from visiting the country 30 or 40 different times. But I think what our listeners should try to do, the ones who are engaging in this kind of dialogue, should focus on just being more pro-Palestinian than the person you're talking to. As long as they are not an anti-Semite, you should get them to be stronger in their views, continue supporting the Palestinians, but do it from a place of honesty. And if you can accomplish that, that is I think the apex of what you could achieve in the environment that we find ourselves in today.
I know that you have to go, but your comment confuses me because I think that people confuse that with anti-Semitism, actually. And that's what I've been hit with many times. I think that when they say, I have compassion, stop the genocide, they don't realize that they are being anti-Semitic when they say stuff like that.
Correct. Well, that's what I'm saying when I say be more authentic. So let me articulate it differently because I do agree with you. Support the Palestinians free of modern day anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Of this occupation, genocide, ethnic cleansing, settlements, all this nonsense that has nothing to do with, their real problems, their real suffering.
Yeah.
Leadership, what the Arab countries are doing, what Hamas does, all the turned down deals. The reason we get blamed for the current situation in Gaza. The reason Gaza is the way it is today is because of Hamas. And only anti-Semitism or an idiot could come to any other conclusion. We did not leave Gaza in that form. We handed it over in a much different place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ron.
Okay, no
It was a
problem. Be in
pleasure
touch. Feel
speaking to
good.
you.
Yes, feel good, Nicole. I'm going to be thinking about you.
All right. I'll
And let
see
me
you soon.
know if we're good. Let's just be in touch maybe over the weekend, and let's try and get another
Yes.
hour or so next week.
Absolutely.
You know, depending on your situation.
Depending on my situation. By the way, for everyone, I'm 9.5 months pregnant right now. So
God bless you. God
on my
bless
way
you.
to the hospital right now.
All right.
Hit that like button and subscribe.